Let's talk a little bit about those ownership costs, aka the indirect costs or the fixed cost. These costs are necessary, and oftentimes these are costs that would still exist even if you didn't operate this specific enterprise. These costs are frequently not tied to any one specific enterprise. These are overhead items, something like, say, maybe insurance that you've got to have for the farm, but that insurance is not tied to this vegetable crop enterprise, and the ownership costs are difficult to assign. A way of thinking about this: if you own a tractor and that tractor is depreciating every single year and you're running multiple enterprises, which enterprise should be paying for the depreciation on the tractor? And the answer to that question is that the ownership costs need to be prorated on some basis to all enterprises. The thing I find funny, the question always becomes, we're supposed to prorate the ownership cost on some basis to all enterprises. What is the basis that we should use? Well, the book gives you some suggestions for methods you could use, but doesn't tell you which one to use. And that's kind of frustrating because it's a really good book and the experts wrote the book, but the experts don't tell us how to prorate. They just tell us you should prorate on some basis. So I'll try to give you some guidance on the proper way to prorate ownership cost across different enterprises. And here's my example. Let's say you put 400 hours on your tractor and 200 of those hours were in the cornfield and 100 in the soybean field, and 100 were spent putting out hay for the livestock. Well, you could look at the number of hours the tractor was used in each enterprise and quickly say, well, half the depreciation needs to go to corn, and then 25% of the depreciation needs to go to soybeans, 25% to livestock. That will be prorating on some basis to all enterprises. Things you can use to prorate: you can use revenue, aka sales or gross receipts, that top of the line across the top for all your enterprises. So if the vegetable crop brought in $5,600 and the corn crop brought in $460 per acre, and you did 50 acres, and the livestock brought in $800 per cow, and you had 50 cows, you would then look at all of that stuff and prorate it across them according to the revenue brought in. You can base it on volume, the number of bushels of corn, the number of bushels of soybeans. You could even base it on cost, right? For example, we have our operating expenses, our variable cost, and if our vegetable crop was 50% of our variable cost, it might make sense to allocate half of our ownership costs to those variable costs. The practical advice is you have to prorate it in such a way that you don't bias your budgets in favor or against some particular crop. For example, a soybean crop here in the U.S. might generate 50 to 60 bushels per acre of soybean. A corn crop might generate 150 to 200 bushels an acre. If you allocate it based on volume, then your corn crop is going to be carrying most of the operating cost. All right. Let's say that you've got 50 bushels of soybeans and you've got 150 bushels of corn on an acre. That means your soybeans are going to be absorbing 25% of your operating cost. You can put 25% of your operating costs into the soybeans. Okay, but here's the problem. Soybeans sell for more than corn does. Soybeans might be selling for $12 a bushel and corn might be selling for $5 a bushel. So you've got a revenue of $750 for your acre of corn, $5 times the 150, but your revenue from the soybeans is $600. So the revenue for the two things are actually pretty close, and that's probably what you're going to find in the real world as well. So if you allocate those operating costs to the corn based on volume, you're going to put too much cost on your corn budget and you're going to bias your corn budget so corn looks less profitable. And so there's no magic bullet for how to allocate this. You just have to make sure the way you're allocating it isn't going to make one of your enterprises look especially rosy and one look especially terrible. And that really is the practical advice I have for you for allocating those operating cost. I always tell people to try to be as accurate as possible. For example, if you're trying to calculate your machinery variable cost, you can total up all fuel usage and divide by acres. And that'll give you a number, but it's not the best number. A better number would be to calculate fuel consumption per hour in each individual enterprise and then calculate hours of machine time in each individual enterprise and use that in order to come up with your numbers for your budget. Here's what I mean by that. Soybeans is mostly no-till. Very very few people are tilling in order to plant soybeans, so there's very little fuel costs associated with soybean operation. It minimizes the passes over the field, and most of the passes are actually pretty light duty. It doesn't take a lot of horsepower to pull a spray rig in order to put down your Roundup when you're growing Roundup Ready no-till soybeans. But there are still some farmers out there that still plow their cornfield. Well, okay, when you're plowing, you're in a low gear and you're at full throttle. So when you're plowing, you're burning a whole lot more fuel than when you're spraying or pulling a no-till drill across a field. And well, what do? Maybe the first year you do your budget, you use method number 1. And maybe year number 2, you've learned more and you've gotten better at your budget. So year number 2, you build a better budget. Don't think you've got to jump into these budgets and build perfect budgets overnight on the first try. This is a tool that's going to evolve as your operation evolves. Now, the details of how to calculate depreciation and interest are a topic for another video, another class, another time. You're going to calculate those costs per year. You're going to allocate those costs to individual machines and then allocate those machine usages across different enterprises when coming up with your operating cost of your machinery. There's going to be a land charge. There are multiple ways that you can come up with your land charge. The most direct and easy way is if you are renting the land, the rent you pay is the land charge. If you own the land, an alternative would be to say, hey, I could rent this land out for $120 an acre. That should be my land charge. Why? Because you've got to capture those opportunity costs. So even though you may not be paying rent in your budget and your accountant isn't going to write that down when they work on your taxes at the end of the year, when you're doing your budget, you've still got to include a land charge to account for the fact that your land has alternative uses. You can look at the opportunity cost of the capital invested. In other words, you can look at the interest that you may have earned. Another idea is to simply use the payment on an acre of land, the principal and the interest together as the payment. Any of those would get you a land charge. Now, what do you do when things get more complicated? There are a lot of complications. And so when you add complications to the production process, you have to add complications to the budget. Double cropping, for example. It's not uncommon for farms to produce multiple crops in one calendar year. The best example I can think of is a corn, wheat, soybean rotation. You plant corn, harvest that corn in September, follow it with winter wheat, harvest that wheat in the spring, but at that point it's too late to follow it with corn because you would be harvesting later than you would need to plant the corn. But you can plant soybeans a little bit later, so you follow up with soybeans, and that's a good idea because it's a legume and it puts nitrogen into the soil, so that's good for your soil fertility. Grow the soybeans. Well, soybeans are harvested kind of late. You might be harvesting your soybeans in December. So you harvest your soybeans and let the land lay fallow over the winter. Follow that with corn. If you're going to do that, you have to include that complexity in your budget. Cover crops. How do you allocate the cost of a cover crop? Well, if the cover crop is just a cover crop, you're not doing anything with it, then it's got to go into the budget for growing the crop. If you're going to graze on your cover crop, you have to make the decision to either allocate the cost of the cover crop to the row crop operation or the livestock enterprise. Storage, transportation, and marketing. The way we traditionally handle this in agriculture is we say that the instant you harvest the crop, the growing of the crop, the farming has ended and you're now in the marketing stage. So storing your crop in a grain bin, transporting your crop to a market, making some nice pretty baskets and going to the farmer's market and sitting there all day selling your vegetables, those are all marketing costs. So the question then becomes, how do you want to incorporate that? Do you want to draw a line in the sand and say, here's the cost of growing the enterprise, and then have a separate budget for the marketing of the enterprise? Or do you want both of those all in the same budget? But you can't ignore the costs that happen post-harvest. They are part of the cost of the operation. Establishment costs for perennial crops. Now, this is interesting because we think about things like trees and blueberries, these kind of things when we think perennial crops, but forages are also perennial crops. If you're grazing your livestock on fescue, that is a perennial crop. There's an establishment phase, a production phase, and there's going to be a net present value calculation. And so you've got to figure out a way in your budget to include the establishment and the production phase in the budget.